Hey YouTube, how's it going? Welcome back to Imperium Gaming and Media. In today's video, we'll be reviewing the third battle of Winterfell from the latest episode of Game of Thrones, The Long Night. This is a follow-up to a video I made last week, in which I previewed the battle through a historical lens by analyzing the Army of the Living strategy and deployment. You can watch it here if you haven't already. With that out of the way, let's get started. Let's begin again with the cavalry. As I mentioned in my last video, the deployment of the Dothraki cavalry in the vanguard, and not along the wings or in reserve, seemed to indicate an offensive-minded strategy, and this is exactly what happened with their opening charge. Historically speaking, there's nothing wrong with striking the enemy first with cavalry, but this is usually only successful in certain situations, such as in a cavalry-on-cavalry charge, or in tandem with support infantry or missile units. The Dothraki horsemen did technically receive catapult and trebuchet support, but only for a single ineffective volley. We'll get back to this in a moment. Unfortunately, and as expected, the Dothraki cavalry were wiped out in a matter of seconds. It was a haunting and chilling sight, and admittedly, it was an example of solid cinematography. However, and from a tactical point of view, this cavalry charge was doomed from the start. Again, the Dothraki cavalry should have instead been placed along the wings of the battle line, where their mobility as horsemen would have proven to be more useful and effective during the course of the battle, reinforcing and supporting the core of the main army and exploiting any open gaps in the enemy forces. So, turning our attention back to the main infantry line, where the Unsullied hold the center, the Knights of the Vale hold the left, and the Wildlings, Night's Watchmen, and others hold the right, we have some problems here. If the Army of the Living intended to meet the enemy on an open battlefield, then they should have planned accordingly and taken their numerical disadvantage into account. Instead of deploying the infantry in a thick battle line with overly dense and packed ranks, the infantry line should have been stretched thin to cover greater ground. This was common practice in history, especially in regards to Greek hoplite phalanx warfare. For example, the severely outnumbered Greeks at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BCE had to stretch their main infantry center thin, from 8 ranks to 4, to prevent an enemy envelopment. Later in the battle, the Athenian left and Plataean right, still arranged 8 ranks deep, were able to successfully rout their opposition, and thus were able to turn and envelop the Persian center, inflicting heavy enemy casualties. I believe the Army of the Living could have executed a similar maneuver. We saw that the Unsullied center could hold their ground, even if stretched thin. A longer battle line with the left and right wings reinforced by both Unsullied infantry and Dothraki cavalry, I imagine a similar outcome could have been possible. Hold the center, and steadily beat back the enemy on the left and right until you can start to envelop the Army of the Dead on 3 sides. Oh, and not to mention with aerial dragon, missile, and artillery support. One last note on the infantry. I will say that I liked seeing the Unsullied slowly fall back in formation. As highly drilled and trained spearmen, they should be able to perform these maneuvers with relative ease. This meticulous drilling and training was one of the defining features of Philip II's reforms of the Macedonian army. You know, the same army that helped his successor, Alexander, carve out the largest empire the world had known at the time. Just a neat little detail from this episode that I really enjoyed. Speaking of missile and artillery support, I have a major problem with their absence from the battle. As I mentioned during my segment on the Dothraki cavalry, the allied catapults and trebuchets fired a single volley, which is just ridiculous. Ideally, and historically speaking, you'd want to wear your enemy down with missile and artillery fire for as long as possible. In this shot, we see a minimum of 5 rounds per siege weapon. Why weren't they all used? It wouldn't have made the biggest impact in the grand scheme of things, but why not use them? In regards to missile support, the walls of Winterfell should have been fully manned with defending archers and skirmishers throughout the course of the battle. There's even a scene later in the battle when the Whites are starting to cross the trench and scale the walls, and Sir Davos Seaworth calls for men to man the walls. The same walls that should have been fully manned from the very beginning. I just don't understand. The Army of the Living, despite all efforts in mustering their forces and entrenching the castle, didn't make full use of their cavalry, artillery, and missile support, or of the positioning of their infantry lines. I understand this is a fantasy show, and it's hard for me to criticize a battle plan against a seemingly overpowered force of undead soldiers who don't feel pain or fear death. However, I still wanted to review and analyze this battle through a historical lens to show how the army of the living could have better prepared themselves, following real-world historical precedents. I think the episode as a whole was incredibly well shot and produced, and I absolutely loved the Miguel Chapachnik and Ramin Djawadi combo. I mean, let's be honest, Djawadi and his musical scores are the real MVPs of Game of Thrones. The dance of dragons between Rhaegal, Drogon, and Viserion was such an intense, well-executed moment that show and book lovers alike have been wanting to see on the big screen for a long time, and I think it delivered. The tension in the opening prelude to the battle had me shaking in my seat, and the final moments between Daenerys and Jorah were truly tragic. Kudos to Emilia Clarke and her performance. I know a lot of fans aren't happy with the Night King's death and the defeat of his army, but I knew it would happen. There just wasn't any other way. Why bring in the Golden Company if they weren't going to have an important role to play this season? I've said this before, and I'll say it again. Cersei Lannister is the main villain of the season, and we'll see another large battle between these two opposing forces in episode 5, which, as if this wasn't enough proof, was also directed by Sapochnik. The Battle of Winterfell had to end this way. What are your thoughts on the episode as a whole? What do you think of the outcome of the battle? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and for more on your favorite historical games, movies, and shows, stay tuned with Imperium Gaming and Media on YouTube and Twitter. Thanks again, and until next time.